How's everybody doing this morning? Very good. It's 10:31, probably go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everybody to the Nebraska Museums Association monthly musings. Today we are going to talk about implementing the changes to the Nebraska Museum Property Act. As I'm sure many of you are aware, NMA took on the task of modernizing and updating the Museum Property Act here in Nebraska. Um, what I think 2 years ago, I know I was working on it a little longer than that, and kind of got nowhere. So about 2 years ago, we started to seriously work on it and got some backing from Senator Aguilar's office and was able to move forward with updating it and modernizing it. Um, the old law was very cumbersome and difficult to use. Um, I think at one point we found out that only like in the was it 30 years that had been implemented, only one or two museums had successfully used it, which makes that's just ridiculous. So we got together and said, well, let's figure out how to make this work for us and what can we change to make it work for us. So we got a little committee together with myself. For those, I think almost everybody knows me, but my name is Karen Kier. I was the former photo curator at Nebraska State Historical Society, and now I am the archivist here at the American Historical Society for Germans from Russia. But I had started working on that when I was at History Nebraska. Um, And then we also have Chris Hostetler. He is the executive director at Sturm Museum. And then Linda um, Endersby, she is the collections manager at Nebraska State Historical Society. And Linda came with a lot of experience working with museum property laws in other states. So we were really excited to have her join our team. Rebecca Maddox was also part of the team as well, but she's not able to join us today. So, with that said, I think we're just gonna kind of jump in with Chris's slides and talk about, um, I'm gonna make you guys, so let me know when you need to flip the slides, okay? All right. You guys can see the slides, right?
Yes, we can, Karen.
Okay, thank you. All right. Here. And then I plan on having lots of time at the end so we can have kind of a more open discussion about it and try to answer questions as well.
If you want me to start, Karen, you can go ahead and flip the slide.
Okay, my computer's just being really slow, so here we go.
Okay.
There we go.
So hi everybody. Good morning. It's good to see everybody. I'm Chris, the executive director of Sturm Museum, and I recently put together a presentation for actually that we just delivered this week to the Buffalo County Historical Society on the implementation of the Nebraska Museum Property Act as it was updated. And so I thought that I would just share a couple of slides from that as my portion of this presentation. I conducted that presentation with April White. Some of you know she is the president of the Nebraska Museums Association. A lot of kudos go out to Nebraska Museums Association for pulling this one across the line, I think. I tried to put some of this information just into layman's terms because Linda and Karen and I all know it was at times painful to deal with this process because it's all legalese and it's difficult to understand. And I think maybe at times it's probably intentionally made that way. So I kind of tried to boil this down to what it's really about. And the Nebraska Museums Property Act is really about assertion of title. That's what it is, and also communicating that assertion of title to the public. Um, as you've heard already, we updated that legislation through work that was done in all of 2023. And then it was signed by the governor in March of 2024. And then, of course, there's a waiting period. So it was enacted in July of 2024. Just a quick opinion. So I put an opinion alert on there. This is not a fact, it's just an opinion. But we worked really hard to update the law so that we could comply with the law. But if we don't follow the law, then it won't be any better than the previous legislation that was in place for, well, since 1996. So museums really have to work hard, collecting organizations really have to work hard to try to comply with this law so that we can show that it actually works. Um, and I think we can. So Karen, if you want to advance to the next slide, please. So what the law says in layman's terms, I know Linda's going to share some of this as well. You'll see terms like lender throughout the law as it's written now. That just means the donor of an object to a collecting agency. And so there's two things to really focus on in the law as it's written now that are very important for collecting organizations to be attuned to. First of all, if we know who a lender is or a donor of an object, and we know how to contact them, and we want to deaccession an object that's in our collection that has no other records accompanying it, that means we don't really know when it came to us, how it came to us, all those things, but we do know how to reach that lender. Before we deaccession that piece, we need to reach out to that lender via notice, which is either a certified mail or a courier, some way to get a signature saying that we've informed them that we are deaccessioning that object and moving it from our collection. That is actually in 51-703 of the current law. Now, here's the big one, because most of the time this is the case when we try to exact this disposition on this artifact. We don't know who the lender was. It's a founding collection item that Karen can talk to us very, very adroitly about, because there's a lot of these in collections around the state, various organizations. If we don't know the lender, then we have to provide public notice, letting them know that we are going to assert title. And that's really the juxt of this law. And that's 51-703, bowlegged 4, if you want to look it up. And it states in quotation marks, I'm not going to read that because you all can read it, but we need to post that publication on our organization's website for a minimum of 3 consecutive weeks. Now, that could be a whole listing, actually, of items that we're going to deaccession. It doesn't have to be one. It could be a whole litany of items that we're deaccessioning, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We also have to run for 1 week in a newspaper of general circulation. Predominantly probably applies to where we're located because we don't know the lender, so at least presumably, we don't know the county where that lender lives. So we run that in a county or an adjacent county newspaper of general circulation. There's about 11 counties in Nebraska that don't have access to a local newspaper, so we'd have to go to the adjacent county. And that newspaper article must contain our organization's name, our organization's contact information, and that we are asserting title. And then we direct interested parties that they should contact us, the organization, for a complete listing of that property to which we are asserting title. Now, why is it written this way? It's written this way because the previous law, you had to have a very detailed description of each item that you were deaccessioning, and it had to be ran in the newspaper for 3 weeks. We are talking about thousands of artifacts in some cases, which would make it very cost prohibitive to actually run an article of public notice. In this new law, the way it's written now, you can have just a few lines. What is articulated in A, B, and C of that statute. Those are the only things that we have to share. The descriptions of the items that we're deaccessioning, that can be housed at the museum. We can put it on the website. Um, People contact you. It could be to talk about those things. The more detailed descriptions could be kept locally in the office on hard copy paper for that matter, as long as there's somebody there who could talk and discuss with somebody who calls about what those items are. Any questions about this one so far? Maybe next slide then, Karen. So a few best practices. Linda, do you have a lot of this in your slides too, by the way?
No, actually, this is not in my slides. So I think
Okay.
this is great to go through this.
Okay, I'll touch some of these best practices. Now, some of this is also opinion, but these best practices are taken not only from the Nebraska Museums Association, my colleagues on that board, but also from the American Alliance of Museums, which is recognized as the accrediting body for museums across the country. So here's some best practices that we can share. First of all, a good practice is that we keep meticulous documentation on our collection. Now, in most cases, most organizations, including my own, don't necessarily have that meticulous documentation dating back in time. What we need to do is draw a line in the sand and say, from this point forward, we're going to keep meticulous documentation on the collection. There's no use in trying to go back and research and try to fix things from 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years ago, which is basically a drill in futility. But in drawing the line in the sand, that means that we should use things like deed of gifts, condition reports. Why are condition reports important? Well, condition reports are important for that artifact because when you go to deaccession it and somebody wants to dispute that artifact, it very well could end up in court according to the legislation if we don't follow procedures. Condition reports may come into play in that. Loan agreements. The law actually covers loans to other museums as well or other organizations. And then, of course, communications. What are communications? Any communications that you've had with donors, with other institutions that have had a hand in having some type of custody of that artifact. I will use an example real quickly so that we can kind of typify that. We are currently trying to develop provenance as well as custody for some artifacts that happen to be human remains um, that almost 3 decades ago were sent to the Smithsonian for analysis. Somewhere along the line, uh, none of that was really documented well with actual paperwork. Chain of custody type paperwork. What we do have are various communications vis-a-vis letter. Later on, we had some emails when email started to become used. And it's fortunate for us that we can kind of piece together some of those communications to try to develop a record for that artifact so that we can identify what it is and hopefully deaccession it and get it to where it properly should be. So those communications are very important. One of the things that we have done at Stewart Museum is we've established a very strong collection committee of people who have some knowledge of artifacts from within our community so that we've moved the deaccessioning process from a rather subjective practice to an objective process, where you actually have a more democratic method where it's not just one voice saying, yeah, we need to deaccession this piece. Because let's face it, we're all not material culture experts. And when push comes to shove, if a deaccession of an item is disputed in the court of public opinion, really nice to have a committee to fall back on and say, well, this just wasn't Karen Kier's decision to do this. This is a decision of about 4 or 5 professionals. Of course, we like that committee to rely on professional staff. We certainly do. Written collection policies for our organizations, super important, because think about if this ever does go to court over an artifact. One of the things that can help you, it may not save you, but it certainly could help you, is if you have a written collection policy that you can put out there and say, hey, this is our policy. We have followed that policy. And oh, by the way, the American Alliance of Museums says that every collecting organization should have a collection policy in place. So that's important for us. And then the progression when an item is deaccessioned, when an artifact is deaccessioned, is that we have the option of the first option, always the first option, is to transfer that object to an institution that is what we call held in public trust, another museum, a historical society, a professional collecting body. We try to keep that piece of history alive in another appropriate institution. The second thing that you can do, which is a little problematic, is you can actually auction that artifact off. Now, this should be done nowhere near your organization, because there are certain things that you don't want to have happen. First of all, there is nobody who is connected to your organization who could bid on this item, would try to acquire this object. That has to be protected. So one way of doing this is finding an auction house that is a good distance away from your organization to handle and manage that. Certainly, you would not want to hold an auction on your organization's physical site and do this. You would want to make sure that you had somebody that was a fair piece that was handling this, a fair piece away. The second thing that I would say about those auction items is that the American Alliance of Museums states in its best practices that any revenue that is gained by the sale of an artifact must be restricted to the care of the permanent collection. It can't be used to pay Chris's salary, for example. It needs to be reinvested into that collection, into that care of that collection, or acquiring another artifact for that collection. And then the final thing that you can do is if that object is not museum quality, maybe it's degraded so much, maybe it's mouse ridden, maybe it's moldy, maybe it's toxic, you can actually destroy that artifact, but it needs to be truly destroyed. If it's a piece of broken pottery, for example, it needs to be smashed into powder, basically, and gotten rid of so that it cannot be used for some other purpose. I would suggest that both number 2 and number 3 of this transfer process requires a real dedication to protocols outlined by the American Alliance of Museums. It's on their website. You can find it readily, but also a well-established and informed committee if you're going to be successful with this. Once again, we're not all experts in material culture, or maybe we have expertise in material culture that's confined to a certain window of time, a certain period of history. So it's nice to have other folks and policies in place that we can follow and protocols. Any question on this? By the way, according to the current law, when an item is when we follow the law and we do the public notice and we put it out there, After we do that, we have to wait 1 year before we can actually remove that artifact from our collection and exact the disposition. We have to sit on it for a year.
Yeah.
Next slide.
Um,
Go ahead,
I was
Karen.
just going to say that anybody who is interested in like sharing their collections policy or are seeing collection policies from other institutions, that's what NMA is here for. So you can reach out to one of your area reps, or I'd be happy to share AHSGR's collection policy. I'm sure Chris would be happy to share stores. I know that I don't know if a
Our,
yours is online, right?
yep, Nebraska State Historical Society, our collections management policy is available online.
So there's lots of examples of great collections policies. There's no reason to start from scratch. You know, copying is the best form of flattery. Don't reinvent the wheel. Just tweak it to what you need your institution to do. So
Karen, I think that was a powerful addition to our presentation, just that statement. It's amazing how many collecting bodies across our state do not have a collection policy and struggle with where to start. So I think Karen is exactly right. We, you know, borrow someone else's collection policy and start from there. Easiest thing to do. Just cross out the name if you have to and put in your organization, you know.
yeah, it
Um,
really is that easy a lot of the time. Okay. Chris, those were the slides that you sent me, so I don't know if you
that's all I
had.
have.
Okay. So we're going to move on to Linda's.
Mhm. Yes. Um, so I want to stress a couple things, reiterate a couple things that Chris said. One is this is about assertion of title. You're asserting title if because you may want to deaccession it, or you're asserting title because you may want to do conservation on it. You may be asserting title because it's going to be the main big object in your big exhibit, and you want to make sure that you know that you own it, and that you have the right to do with it with what you want. So this is about asserting title. The second thing that Chris hinted at was documentation, documentation, documentation. No matter what you do in this process, document what you are doing. And part of the museum property law does say you retain the records. If you do this, you retain them for 25 years. So those are some very important things that I just wanted to stress again that Chris had mentioned. My slides are informational. They're not exciting or anything. I think these slides become available so you can look back at some of the stuff as a resource. I'm just going to highlight some of this, and I'm going to be in the nitty gritty. With museum property acts, there's usually three different kinds of things we're dealing with. One is old loans. Most of us have what we called permanent loans, or back in 1915, they loaned it to you for 10 years and nothing else was done. So that is covered by this law. The other thing is undocumented property. That's found in collections where we have no documentation to say who it came from. This can also be if you have documentation saying something was a loan, but you have no information on the lender, then you're essentially dealing with that piece as undocumented property. In some states, the law will specifically talk about doorstep drops, where people leave something at your front door so that when you come in the morning, it's there and you have no information. Nebraska's law does not specifically talk about this. So to use this law for that, you essentially deal with it as undocumented property. Go ahead, Karen, if you will. Um, And this is just specific information in the law from old loans. I think if you click Karen, it will go to information behind. So one thing that I want to mention is that if it's a permanent loan where you have a known lender, The law did not change anything. This is still being dealt with the same way that you did before. And these things are specified in the law. It specifies you have to send certified mail. It specifies what the letter is to contain. So there's a specific list of things that have to be in that letter. This is where you know the lender and you have an address. Go ahead and click. This is just example text that I've used in certified letters to known lenders. I do want to point out the words in red are specifically in the Nebraska law. So those are specific words that you want to put in your letter, no matter what you do. And Chris did mention, I've got it highlighted in red, that they do have 1 year to respond. Go ahead and click. One thing I want to note is even if you know very well that when you send this out, it's going to come back because that address is incorrect, you still need to send the letter. The law specifies restricted certified mail. And even if it comes back saying no known address, no known person, that's part of your documentation. Also, if it does go to somebody, it has to come back with that proof of receipt has to come back within 30 days. These are some things specified in the law. Go ahead and click. And one thing that happens is if you do actually find the lender, there are some specific things that they have to respond with, which is preservation of interest in loaned property. And there are some specific things that they have to send to you. Go ahead and click. And then here, this is where there are things that if you know it's a loan, but you don't know the identity of the lender, if you don't have an address or telephone number, and if you don't receive proof of receipt within 30 days, you are now dealing with that old loan essentially as undocumented founding collections. Go ahead and click. And this is previous to what just happened in July of this year. For each and every piece in your collection, you had to do this specific notice. This is actually a receipt from when I used the Museum Property Act in Missouri a number of years ago. In that case, it was over $100 for this one piece, which makes it expensive. Go ahead and click. Yeah, so this is something that Chris already pointed out, that now for undocumented items, you do not have to have a newspaper notice for every single item. This is a key thing that was changed. And I'll be honest, I think Chris and Karen would agree. What we got passed is not perfect. There are still things that need to be changed in it. But this is the one major piece that we got changed that is, I believe, the most significant, is for the undocumented property for doorstep drops and all of these things. All you have to do is post a short notice in the newspaper for 1 week. And then all the detail on all those objects goes in a listing on your website, which is less cost. And this is a major difference in what's going on here. I know for our organization, we currently have a list of hundreds of objects. And so for us, what we're planning to do is do one newspaper notice, and then we will have that listing available for anyone who contacts. It will be a much easier process. Excuse me, go ahead and click.
And Linda, and if I could add real quick, I
Yep.
just want to add some agreement to what you said. This is certainly not a perfect, this is not what we initially submitted, but rather it was a compromise to get this law um, updated. And I think that's important. We did compromise. Um, Nevertheless, the way that it is written now, an organization can do exactly what Linda described. You could have hundreds of items listed, their description, and have a very small newspaper ad that of public notice that may cost you $13 to $30 to put it in the paper. You could even program to do that a couple of times a year if your organization planned well, where you could have a specific time that you notified people that you were asserting title. And then all that background work could be done in advance of those times that you post. That's just what I wanted to say, Linda.
Yes, and actually for the Nebraska State Historical Society, that's our exact plan is twice a year we'll do a newspaper ad. Um, until we get caught up and then we will have this listing available. So as Chris had already mentioned, here are these A, B, and C. This is all that the newspaper ad needs to say is the museum's name and contact information, that the museum is asserting title on objects, and if you're interested in these things, to contact the museum. If you click, I've got sample text for all that you would need to be in there. That they're asserting title, that you should contact the museum, and then there again, there's that 1 year. It's unfortunate we have to wait a full year. That's one of the things that we might have tried to make shorter, but compromise. We didn't have to, but this is the simple text of what you would have to put in the newspaper, and this is not going to cost much. I do want to speak up for Nebraska and the Nebraska Museums Association. We were one of 5 states that introduced legislation to update their Museum Property Act this year. Nebraska was the only one that got anything passed. So we really are ahead of the game on this. So I can't say enough about the efforts that were done to get this passed. Um, if you click again, so then notice by publication online, you essentially have the exact same text as you have from the newspaper, and then below that, you've got your full list. Um, So you're essentially doing the exact same thing. Um, go ahead and click. I'm trying to remember what else is. Oh, and this just mentions the 2 things that if the claimant has to respond after the claimant, if nobody's responded within 1 year, then it's yours. I do want to point out one thing for the undocumented property, the doorstep drops. We still have to wait 7 years. So before anything goes on that list, you need to have proof that it's been in your possession for at least 7 years. That's another thing that I think would be nice to get down to less time. Although I worked in Michigan and there you had to wait 35 years. So 7 isn't as bad, but there are some states who are down to 1 or 2. So there's just a couple things that I wanted to mention about this. And that may be it for, is that my last slide? Yeah, questions. So I've done this in other states. So that's part of why I've got this detail. So I'm happy to answer questions, whether now or after. But I am so excited about the ability to do this with one newspaper ad and a list on the website. I think it's great for museums to be able to do this.
So I
Linda,
think we
go ahead, Karen.
Okay. So I think we talked a lot about like like establishing title to get rid of stuff, but we also established title to keep stuff as
Yes.
well. So you know, let's say you have something that you don't have, you technically can't send it to be have like a conservation treatment without title as well,
Yep.
because it doesn't belong to the museum. So by establishing title, then you can also treat it and preserve it. Um, it's just not taking up space on your shelf. You're able to, you know, give it the proper life that it needs.
Karen, I think you hit a really good point in the sense that just sound collection management would demand that we actually take a hard look at our collection and things that we don't have title on that we intend to keep in our collection.
Yes.
Part of cleaning up those records would be this process to assert that
Mhm.
title to ensure that we actually have the proper documentation and we've taken the steps to make sure that we have title for their object.
Absolutely.
Yes, as collections manager, that's really important to me is this is about asserting title so that we can use it. And that means either give it to somebody else, conserve it, exhibit it, to do all the things with it. And then we don't have to worry about questions coming up if we have actual title to it. And I think we all have stuff that we don't have title to.
That is true. I was going to share. Where in the world is it? Okay, let me make this big. Let me share my screen again. So this is I developed this when I was at History Nebraska, but this is my founding collection decision map. And I found it very helpful, like is it accessioned, is it not accessioned? And it kind of just leads to you to where you need to go, whether it is the Property Act or somewhere else. And I think that this kind of just lays it all out I'm a visual person, so it helps me see it kind of laid out um, in a way that it just says, this is how you go about deciding what to do with items in your collection, whether it be deaccession it, run it through the Museum Property Act, or run it through your founding collections policy. So, and I think this is posted on the monthly Musings website from when I did the founding collections policy program a year ago, year and a half ago. I'm not even sure. Oh, there's somebody in the waiting room. I hope they haven't been in the waiting room very long. All right. Any questions? Anybody looking forward to using it?
I have a quick question relating establishing ownership. You know, you used examples, several of you use examples from like 1915 or 1926 or even 50 years ago. So most of those people are probably deceased. So how if someone comes in and says, "Hey, I am so and so's daughter," what type of proof would you require, or does anybody have anything? I mean, we can't really just take their word for it, saying, yeah, that they are that person's daughter, son, or granddaughter, or whatever. I mean, what types of things do you think we should have? What proof should they be required to establish that yes, they might be the heir of the people who initially donated or loaned it?
Yeah, I did this a couple times in Missouri. And there are a couple things. They do have to establish ownership. If they're not the person, then they have to establish that they're the heir and the only heir. And this is where it can get complicated for these people, because that means either wills or probate records to show that they are the heir and that they are the only heir, because I have come across instances in which grandchild tried to assert ownership, and yet there were other grandchildren that had equal legal rights. So legal documents, and it can sometimes be hard for the family to produce those legal documents. But unless they have legal documents showing that they are indeed the heir, then I wouldn't turn it over to them. In one case, actually, we had a loan from an organization, and they actually had to produce legal documentation that they were still that organization and the appropriate sort of descendant organization of that one. So even in that case, they had to show legal documentation. And I do, in some states, there's actually a fancy form that's created that's like notice of intent to preserve interest in property on loan. And I can share that form. It's helpful because that has them fill it out, put down everything that they know in a organized form, and then they would accompany that by copies of wills or probate or things like that. So it can be difficult, but we've only turned it over to people on loans if they've got the legal documentation.
Thanks. That clarifies. We have an issue with something that's not on loan, but that was donated, and 50 years later, now family members all of a sudden want it back. And it's like, no. But first of all, you have not established any sort of proof that you are who you say you are. So, but that helps clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah, we've only done actual legal documentation.
What we have found helpful, I guess, in predicting for the future too, is that we actually have some deeds of gift in our records that somehow, and maybe it was because the donors wanted it this way, we had clauses for keeping the item or the object in our collection in perpetuity. I guess I would suggest that if there's those clauses out there, you really should examine the what if scenarios that accompany those, keeping it into perpetuity. Because that can become problematic, 30, 40, 50 years after the fact. And so we've in our latest accessions into our collection, we've removed those clauses, and we've actually met with the donors and talked about the artifacts, and talked about the fact that this is our intention, but we can't predict what's going to happen 40, 50 years from now. So letting them know up front that this artifact may not remain in this collection forever. And most all that we've talked to have accepted that in that gift agreement.
Well, and we've had those discussions, and we give specific examples. For example, one of our collections is our library collection. And at one point in time, that library collection would include like a full set of Pennsylvania Historical Review, because people couldn't search the internet and that stuff wasn't available online. But because the way research is done, the way that stuff is kept, we don't need those anymore. So at the time, they were exceptionally useful to people doing research in a collection, but times have changed. And so those are things specifically that we deaccession from the collection. And we use that as an example of how things can change, the world can change. And like Chris said, we can't predict that.
And usually those sets, like encyclopedias, take up tremendous amount of room.
Yeah. I just got done doing a big weeding project in our library, so.
Of course, historically, people aren't going to know what an encyclopedia is in several years. So you might want to keep at least one set just to show that they did exist.
We've had this discussion because we have a library collection and we have an objects collection. There are some times where something used to be in the library collection to do research, and there may be a case in which it wants to go into the object collection because it may become part of an exhibit in the future. So we've actually had those weird kinds of discussions.
Yeah.
One other thing I do want to point out is if you start this process, you have to be willing to give things up. You will have cases in which it's something that you're getting title to because you really want to keep and use it, not because you want to deaccession it. And yet people can come forward and provide that legal documentation, and then you have to give it up. I've been in that situation where we had something that was an amazing object and they wanted it back. They gave us all the proof that they needed and we had to give it back. So that's something to keep in mind as you start this process. You have to be aware that if you start this process, you may have to give up things you don't want to give up.
I want to thank everybody. If there's no more other questions or other anything that anybody wants to share, I want to thank everybody for participating. And this recording, as well as the slides, will be on the NMA website, Nebraska Museums, nebraskamuseums.org, under the monthly musing tab. And just a reminder that next month is October, and October is Family History Month. So I have recruited my coworker, Amber Mickelson, to talk about how AHSGR deals with our reference questions. We actually get a pretty high, for as small of an organization as we are, we get a pretty high number of reference questions. And we've developed a way to track all of that. And Amber has created this very professional looking research report to go along with it. So she is going to be answering questions about reference questions next month. And then November, Erin is going to talk about creating a photo station for photographing artifacts. The Saunders County Historical Society got a grant from the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation to purchase the equipment. So she's going to talk about that. And then in December, which so everybody is aware, because of the holiday that is a week earlier, it's on December 20th. The Ford Centers is going to talk about what they do and what they can do for for Nebraska museums. And then they're also going to talk about how to create condition reports. And then January, we've got Jessica Noyd from Hastings Museum talking about bugs. So she's going to talk about integrated pest management. So we've got a pretty full schedule, but if anybody has ideas or suggestions or would like to give a monthly musing on any topic, museum related, I'm opening up the schedule for 2025. So let me know if you have any ideas. All right. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.